700 against 20,000. Not a metaphor, not rounded up for effect. 700 Australian soldiers of the 3rd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, 3 RAR, against the 118th Division of the Chinese People's Volunteer Army's 40th Army, commanded by Wen Yuchen, a full-strength division, 10,500 bayonets, plus the 60th Division of the 20th Army moving up behind them. Combined, roughly 20,000 men bearing down on a 2-kilometer stretch of Korean River Valley. Force ratio 7-1. These aren't my calculations, these are figures drawn from Chinese and UN order of battle records that historians have been cross-referencing for decades. Night of 24th April 1951. The Kapyong River Valley, 60 kilometers northeast of Seoul. Moon nearly full. Temperature sitting just above freezing. And on a hill that staff maps labelled height 504, 700 Australians were dug in with whatever they could scrape from the rocky ground. They held. When it was over, the American command did something it almost never did. General Order Number 453, Headquarters 8th United States Army Korea. Dated June 23, 1951. Awarded 3 RAR, the Distinguished Unit Citation. Later, redesignated the Presidential Unit Citation. The highest collective award in the United States military, the unit equivalent of the Distinguished Service Cross. The second highest individual valor decoration, but for an entire formation. Across all of America's wars, from the Civil War to Afghanistan, fewer than 20 foreign units have received it. 3 RAR became one of only 2 Australian units in history to wear that blue ribbon. The other was D Company, 6 RAR, for Long Tan in Vietnam, 1966. America recognized what happened, officially, on paper, with a seal, and then the world forgot. Ask anyone outside Australia what they know about the Korean War. They'll say Incheon, maybe Chosin Reservoir, possibly Pork Chop Hill if they've seen the old film. Nobody will say Kapyong, a forgotten battle inside a forgotten war. And this, with a casualty ratio that makes you read the numbers twice. 32 Australians killed, 59 wounded. Chinese losses estimated at over 2,000 dead. Remember that ratio, you'll need it. To understand what happened on height 504, you need to understand who was standing on it. 3 RAR began life as the 67th Battalion, raised on Morotai on the 20th of October, 1945, from volunteers across 4 Australian divisions, the 3rd, 6th, 7th and 11th. They shipped to Japan as part of the British Commonwealth Occupation Force, garrisoned in Hiroshima Prefecture, redesignated 3rd Battalion, the Australian Regiment on 23 November 1948. Granted the royal prefix by King George VI on March 31, 1949, when North Korea crossed the 38th parallel on June 25, 1950, 3 RAR was the only Australian battalion still in Japan. Understrength, underarmed, patchy on training. They were reinforced with K-Force volunteers, blokes who'd fought their way across New Guinea and Borneo, come home, hung up the uniform, and then raised their hands again when the call went out for Korea. Bricklayers, graziers, truck drivers who still had their campaign ribbons in the bottom drawer. By September 1950, the battalion had grown to roughly 960 men. They joined the British 27th Brigade, 1st Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, 1st Middlesex Regiment, which became the 27th British Commonwealth Brigade. Their commanding officer was Lieutenant Colonel Charles Hercules Green, DSO, one of the youngest battalion commanders the Australian Army had produced during the Second World War, took command at 25. On September 27, 1950, the battalion boarded the US NS Aiken Victory at Kure and landed at Pusan the next day. By April 1951, 3 RAR had been fighting continuously for 7 months. Their combat record read like a compressed history of the war itself. The Apple Orchard at Yongju. Their first action, October 22, 1950. A fast bayonet charge against a numerically superior force. The Battle of the Broken Bridge at Kujin. Cheongju on October 29th. A combined arms attack that marked the furthest Australian advance into North Korea. Then the Chinese intervened. The bitter retreat south. The grinding UN counter-offensive of early 1951, 255 casualties before they ever reached Kapyong. The battalion knew what a fight looked like, and then they lost their CO. Around November 5th, 1950, Colonel Green was mortally wounded by shrapnel while resting in his tent, the only casualty from those rounds. Command passed to his second-in-command, Major Ian Bruce Ferguson, promoted to temporary lieutenant colonel on November 8th. Ferguson, you're going to want to remember this name. Born April 13th, 1917 in Wellington, New Zealand. Before the war, a journalist at the Sydney Sun. Enlisted in the Australian Imperial Force on the 3rd of November 1939. Served with the 2 1st Battalion, then the 2 2nd, North Africa, the Middle East, fought along the Kokoda track to Sanananda, where the 2 2nd Battalion was ground from 550 men down to 88, earned the Military Cross at Templeton's Crossing on the 20th of October 1942. The Australian Dictionary of Biography describes him this way: excellent eye for terrain, outstanding map reader, orders clear and concise, invariably close to the action. Those who knew him well understood that his somewhat brusque manner was a mask for a sensitive nature. He cared deeply for the battalion. He turned 34 10 days before Kapyong, now the company commanders. And here the story acquires a depth that doesn't fit inside a routine after-action report. Major Bernard Ben O'Dowd commanded a company, taken into state care at 4, left school at 14, worked the Kalgoorlie goldfields, red dust, 40-degree heat, underground stopes where grown men passed out from the airlessness. During the Second World War, he was commissioned in the field while serving with the 2nd 11th Battalion, not through connections, not through patronage, because the men followed him and the brass noticed. A man the army didn't raise. The army found him. C Company was commanded by Captain Reginald Reg Saunders, MBE. Stay with me here. Saunders was a Gunditjmara man from Western Victoria, the first Indigenous Australian ever commissioned as an officer in the Australian Army, first, in over a century and a half of military history, the first, and at Kapyong, the first to command a rifle company in battle. His father had been a machine gunner in the First World War. His uncle was killed at Gallipoli, on that very peninsula whose landing day had become the most sacred date in the Australian military calendar. Saunders had already fought through the Second World War, North Africa, Greece, New Guinea. He knew what it meant to lead men under fire, and he knew what it meant to be invisible in your own country. Captain Darcy Laughlin commanded B Company. Captain Norm Gravener led D Company on the summit of Hill 504. These were the men on the hill. An orphan from the goldfields, an Indigenous Australian whose uncle lay buried on the peninsula. The whole nation mourned every 25th of April. A New Zealand-born journalist who'd survived Kokoda. And 700 soldiers who hadn't been out of a fight for 7 months. The Chinese 5th Phase Offensive, the largest single enemy operation of the Korean War. Marshal Peng Dehuai committed 3 army groups and 3 North Korean corps. Total strength, roughly 700,000 troops. Main thrust in the west, 337,000 men across the Imjin River, heading for Seoul. Secondary thrust through the center, down the Kapyong Valley, 149,000. Another 214,000 in support roles. Peng had promised his soldiers they'd be parading through the streets of Seoul on May Day. The offensive struck on the evening of April 22nd. Barely a week earlier, Lieutenant General James Van Fleet had replaced General Matthew Ridgway as 8th Army Commander. Ridgway had departed for Tokyo to replace the recently sacked MacArthur. Van Fleet launched his own offensive, Operation Dauntless, on April 21st. The Chinese counter-offensive swallowed it the very next night. In the Kapyong sector, the ROK 6th Division, under General Chang Do-yong, held positions at the northern end of the valley, 6,000 to 7,000 troops. When the Chinese hit at approximately 1700 on 22nd April, Chang's men had been given barely 1 hour to prepare defenses. They could only occupy hilltop positions, leaving the valleys and flanks wide open. The 179th Regiment of the PVA 60th Division punched straight through the inner battalion of the ROK 2nd Regiment. Within minutes, Both line regiments were in full flight. The reserve 7th Regiment, caught in the current, joined them. By 2300, Chang had lost all communication with his forward units. This wasn't cowardice, that needs saying. The ROK 6th Division ran into infiltration tactics, exploiting gaps between hastily prepared positions, with no artillery support after communications collapsed. Soldiers given an hour to dig in found Chinese behind them before the front was even breached. That's context, not excuse. Captain Brown of 2 PPCLI, 2nd Battalion, Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, described what poured through, a rout. Approximately 4,000 to 5,000 troops fleeing in disorganized panic across and through the forward edges of their positions. Men, women, children, livestock, soldiers shedding weapons and equipment. Chinese troops infiltrated among the retreating ROK soldiers and civilians, penetrating rear areas in uniform and civilian clothes. It became impossible to tell friend from foe. Canadian booby traps were destroyed by fleeing ROK soldiers, tripping them. A gap 10 to 16 kilometers wide tore open in the UN line. Route 17 through the Kapyong Valley was one of the prime invasion routes to Seoul. The 27th Commonwealth Brigade was ordered forward to plug it. Simultaneously, and this matters for scale, on the Western Front, the 29th British Infantry Brigade was fighting for its life at the Battle of the Imjin River. The 1st Battalion, Gloucestershire Regiment, 657 men under Lieutenant Colonel Fred Kahn, held Hill 235 against 3 divisions of the PVA 63rd Army, 27,000 against 657, ratio 25 to 1. Over 3 days, the battalion was reduced to 39 men who escaped, 522 captured, 59 killed. Kahn received the Victoria Cross. The Glosters also received the Presidential Unit Citation. The parallel is exact. 2 Commonwealth battalions, same offensive, same nights, both surrounded, both called artillery onto their own positions. One was destroyed, the other held. The difference wasn't courage. The Glosters fought to the end. The difference was geometry. At the Imjin, the battalion was strung across an 8-kilometer front with no mutual support, and the Chinese approached across a wide river floodplain. At Kapyong, the slopes channeled attacks into narrow corridors where machine guns and artillery created impassable killing zones. The terrain killed, and the Australians understood that. Brigadier Brian Arthur Burke, DSO, who'd assumed command of the 27th Brigade on March 23, 1951 when Brigadier Basil Code departed on compassionate leave, made the bet that defined everything. 2 infantry battalions on the high ground flanking the valley. 3 RAR on hill, 504 eastern side, rising roughly 400 meters above the river. 2 PPCLI on hill, 677 western side, nearly 600 meters high. Between them, 3 kilometers of open valley floor. 1st Middlesex Regiment in reserve, total brigade front, approximately 7 kilometers, far beyond what 2 battalions could defend without gaps. The massive hill 794, Sudok-san, to the northwest was left unoccupied, not enough men. Burke was gambling that firepower would compensate for frontage. 3 RAR's disposition on Hill 504 was textbook Commonwealth defence. D Company under Gravener held the summit, 12 platoon with a Vickers section at the northern end, 11 platoon centrally, 10 platoon on the southwestern edge. A company under O'Dowd occupied a spur running northwest from the summit, 3 platoons echeloned down the slope. C Company under Saunders sat on the rear spur, roughly 300 meters behind A Company, positioned to counterattack if anything broke through. B Company under Laughlin held a small but prominent hill at the northwest foot of Hill 504, adjacent to the tributary stream and the road, the most exposed position of the lot. And then there was battalion headquarters. Here's where the problems start. Ferguson's BHQ sat in a small gully south of the Kapyong River ford, 1.5 to 2 kilometers from the forward companies. This wasn't Ferguson's choice. 9 Corps headquarters required the placement to manage the ROK withdrawal. Tactically, it was a disaster. It put the battalion's brain directly on the main enemy approach route. Communications made the vulnerability worse. 3 RAR used the wireless set number 31 VHF line of sight. Ferguson's HQ sat in low ground. The VHF signals couldn't reach the companies on the heights because the terrain masked the signal. Forward companies could talk to each other, but not to their commanding officer. Messages had to be relayed through C Company, slow, clumsy. Field telephone lines were cut when ROK vehicles drove over them during the retreat. Neither the Australians nor the Canadians had time to lay mines or barbed wire. No materials, no time. Companies dug weapon pits, built sangars from rock where the ground was too hard for shovels, and waited. An April night in central Korea. Dry, cold air, 2-3 degrees above zero. Hill 504 wasn't bare rock but low scrub over narrow gullies cut into the slope. Stone under a thin skin of soil. The shovel goes in 20-30 centimeters and hits bedrock. Weapon pits were more stone breastworks than proper trenches. From the summit, a view across the valley washed in moonlight. The river below, maybe 15 meters across, fordable at knee depth. The road along the riverbank choked with people, trucks, livestock, and somewhere in that mess, Chinese soldiers in civilian clothes, indistinguishable from refugees. Sergeants checked arcs of fire. Machine gunners laid out belts. Someone lit a cigarette cupped in both hands, shielding the glow. Quiet. Then, bugles. The decisive infantry weapon at Kapyong was the Vickers .303 water-cooled medium machine gun. Maximum range of 4 kilometers, sustained fire rate of 250 rounds per minute. On the steep, narrow slopes of Hill 504, Chinese attacks came, as veterans described them, on a very steep slope on a narrow front of 4 to 5 men supported by many others in depth, ideal killing ground for interlocking machine gun fire. In the Korean cold, crews added antifreeze to the water jacket to prevent freezing. The Vickers shaped Chinese tactical decisions. PVA commanders redirected attacks to sectors where the heavy guns couldn't reach, but the decisive arm was artillery. The 16th Field Regiment Royal New Zealand Artillery, 24 QF 25-pounder guns in 3 batteries of 8, backed by a battery of 18 105mm self-propelled howitzers from the US 213th Field Artillery Battalion. A National Guard outfit that had fired its first combat round only on April 22nd. A battery of 8-inch howitzers from the 17th Field Artillery Battalion became available on the afternoon of the 24th. The NZ Regiment controlled fire from both its own guns and the American battery, with NZ officers dispatched to the US batteries carrying radio sets to coordinate fire orders, and here, the critical failure that nearly undid the whole defense. On the first night, New Zealand forward observation officers couldn't reach 3 RAR's company positions before dark. Defensive fire tasks were not registered before the battle started. Under the arrangement with the ROK 6th Division, neither the NZ Regiment nor the US battery had pushed their own FOO parties forward. They'd relied on ROK observers using ROK communications, and ROK communications collapsed entirely. The NZ guns initially couldn't provide accurate close support because they hadn't surveyed their hastily occupied gun position either. When the NZ forward observer with A Company was killed during the night fighting and his party was separated from their radio, that company lost coordinated artillery support altogether. They stood on a hill, no mines, no wire, no comms to their CO artillery that hadn't been registered, and 20,000 coming. 22nd of April, 1700, the 118th and 60th Divisions, PYVVA, strike the ROK 6th Division. By midnight, the South Koreans are finished. 23rd of April, morning. Ferguson and Stone conduct reconnaissance. Company commanders receive orders. During the afternoon, 3 RAR begins occupying Hill 504. 2 PPCLI moves on to Hill 677. 23rd April, 1800 to 2000, ROK elements withdraw again through Commonwealth positions. Thousands of soldiers and civilians flood the valley. The NZ guns and the Middlesex pull back down the congested road behind 3 RAR. The 16th Field Regiment redeploys behind 3 RARHQ in darkness, unable to survey their new position. Around 21:15, a nearly full moon rises over the battlefield. Around 21:30, the battle begins. The first Chinese attack falls on the outpost of US Sherman tanks, 4 Platoon, A Company, 72nd Heavy Tank Battalion, forward of B Company 3 RAR, beaten back. Within the hour, the vanguard of the PVA 354th Regiment reaches Australian positions. Chinese soldiers who'd infiltrated among the fleeing ROK troops penetrate the position along the road. Around 22:30, a heavier assault hits the American tanks. Lieutenant Di Martino, the platoon commander, takes a mortal wound. He'd been fighting with hatches open against infiltrating infantry. 3 other tank commanders are seriously wounded. Before dying, Di Martino orders a fighting withdrawal. Lieutenant Young, B Company's 2 IC, tries to stop the tanks, manages to hold one. From midnight to dawn, 2 Chinese battalions hammer B and A companies, fighting in darkness under moonlight, at ranges measured in paces, not meters. The Vickers guns run continuously, water in the cooling jackets boiling, crews topping up from canteens. Chinese come up the slope 4 or 5 abreast, with dozens behind them, hundreds behind the dozens. The slope is steep, the front is narrow, and the machine gun works like a scythe. Bodies tumble downhill. The next wave steps over them. The fighting goes on until morning. C and D companies cop probing attacks, the Chinese mapping the shape of the Australian defence, finding the weak points, counting the fire positions. A 3rd Chinese battalion swings south around the Australian left flank and hits Battalion HQ on the low ground by the river. And here's the moment that splits this battle into before and after. Between 5:15 and 6 o'clock on April 24th, Ferguson withdraws Battalion HQ without telling his company commanders. The relay link through C Company, already fragile, went dead. O'Dowd and the other officers discovered at dawn that their CO had vanished. No order, no warning, no handover of command. Comms were barely working anyway. Now the battalion had no head. Something needs to be said about Ferguson. He wasn't a coward. His record proves the opposite. Kokoda, Sanananda, the military cross earned in a fight where his battalion lost 5 out of every 6 men. But his HQ was sitting in a tactically idiotic position, forced on him by a higher headquarters, and when a Chinese battalion walked straight onto that position, he had no means to hold it, and no way to reach his companies on the hill. He made the decision to preserve the headquarters group. Whether that was the right call, historians still argue. Bob Breen, in his 1992 analysis, sidesteps the question carefully. The veterans are less careful. Think about that. 4 rifle companies on a hill, Chinese on every side, the battalion commander, location unknown, radios can't punch through the terrain, and at this moment, effective field command passes to Major Ben O'Dowd, the orphan from the Kalgoorlie goldfields, the man the state abandoned at age 4. He didn't wait for orders. There was no one left to give them. Dawn, April 24th. A company discovers Chinese have infiltrated its position overnight. O'Dowd throws 3 platoon into a counterattack. By 7 o'clock, they've retaken 1 platoon's original position. B Company finds Chinese occupying old bunkers on a knoll, hand-to-hand fighting with grenades and bayonets. Lieutenant Len Montgomery leads a bayonet charge, clearing the position trench by trench. He'd earned the military cross for it. Meanwhile, the NZ artillery finally gets into position for effective close support. Observer parties with forward companies are doubled. Fire is brought to within 50 meters of Australian positions. 50 meters. That's the length of your street. Shells from the 25-pounders detonating close enough that the blast heat seared faces in the trenches. In the first 6 attacks on 12 platoon D Company, the Chinese lose approximately 30 killed. The defenders, 7 wounded. Sergeant S.K.J. Len Lenoy, a Gunditjmara man and Second World War veteran, is killed manning a Vickers machine gun with a company. Another Indigenous Australian who gave his life for a country that, for decades, hadn't considered him a full citizen. And then, napalm. 40 minutes before the withdrawal from the position, a US Marine Corsair drops napalm onto D Company. Not on the Chinese, on our blokes. Coordination error. The pilot couldn't distinguish defender trenches from enemy positions on a slope covered in identical scrub. Sergeant Ray Mackenzie watched the silver canister fall. Slowly, it seemed to him, though it was a second at most. The napalm exploded and took all the oxygen out of the air. A wall of fire, liquid flame that clings to skin and burns at over 1,000 degrees. 8 men seriously burned, some on faces and hands, wherever clothing didn't cover. The Chinese watched and immediately launched another assault. D Company beat that one off too. During the afternoon of April 24th, Ferguson makes the call. The position won't hold. Order to withdraw. Stone on Hill 677 overhears the radio transmission. Withdraw as best you can to the Middlesex positions. I can no longer keep control. And again, O'Dowd. He takes effective field command. Plans the fighting withdrawal of all 4 rifle companies along a ridge running 3 kilometers southwest from Hill 504. B Company lays down 10 minutes of continuous heavy machine gun fire as cover. D Company leaves last, Chinese on their heels. During the withdrawal, the Australians run into Chinese who've occupied their former BHQ position. Short, sharp fight. 81 PVA soldiers killed, 4 Australians dead. When the 1st Marine Division gets through on the radio, they inform the Australians that 3 RAR has been reported wiped out. O'Dowd's response, I've got news for you. We are still here, and we are staying here. 1930, 24th April, 3 RAR completes the withdrawal to the Middlesex position. Not a single man lost during the move. Historian Bob Breen called it a superb military feat. 3 RAR casualties for the battle, 32 killed, 59 wounded, 3 captured. Night of 24th to 25th April, the Chinese pivot. The full weight of the 118th Division turns against 2 PPCLI on Hill 677. Lieutenant Colonel James Riley Stone, the Canadian CO, had already repositioned B Company from the northern edge to the eastern flank, covering the gap left by 3 RAR's withdrawal, a piece of tactical foresight that saved his battalion. Wave after wave, B Company takes the first hit, hand-to-hand fighting in the weapon pits. The .50 caliber machine guns concentrate on Chinese fording the river. 71 bodies would be counted on the riverbanks the next morning. Then, the Chinese shift to D Company on the far left, beyond the arc of concentrated MG fire. PVA infiltrate through gaps between platoons. The company is surrounded on 3 sides. 10 platoon is overrun, and here, Lieutenant Mike Levy, 10 platoon, D Company, 2 PPCLI, born in Bombay, raised in Shanghai. Spoke Chinese dialects, Mandarin and Cantonese. A man who'd grown up hearing Chinese speech now heard it from the darkness beyond his breastwork. Chinese soldiers were inside his weapon pits, grenades going both directions, and Levy was shouting at the attacking officers in their own language. We are Canadian soldiers. We have lots of Canadian soldiers here. Not negotiating, disorienting, buying seconds. Then he made the call that defines this battle through Captain J.G.W. Wally Mills, D Company commander. Levy requested that the 16th Field Regiment, Royal New Zealand Artillery, 24 guns 7.2 kilometers distant, fire directly onto his own coordinates. Think about that. Onto us. Not near us. Not on the approaches. On us. Because the only chance of surviving was killing the men already standing next to you. Stone authorized it. The New Zealand 25-pounders fired airburst shrapnel, shells fused to detonate meters above the ground. Not contact fuses, not on impact with the dirt. Airburst. The shell opens in the air and rains steel fragments downward like metal rain. A man lying in a slit trench 1.5 meters deep is shielded. A man standing on the surface is dead. The entire bet rested on the Canadians staying in their pits while the Chinese stayed above ground. The bet paid off. Shells fell within 5 to 6 meters of Canadian slit trenches. The ground shook hard enough to bounce men off the bottom of their pits. Shrapnel pinged off the rock breastworks. The bombardment was called 3 separate times during the night, each barrage lasting 15 to 20 minutes. Approximately 2,300 rounds struck on and around 10 platoons position. Across the entire brigade front that night, the New Zealand guns fired more than 14,000 rounds. Not a single Canadian defender died from the friendly fire. The Chinese, caught above ground, were shredded. The wave stopped. Levy survived. He received no decoration. By multiple accounts, Stone refused to nominate a Jewish officer for a medal. In 2004, Governor-General Adrienne Clarkson granted Levy a special coat of arms with the motto, "I have prevailed." He died in 2007. The South Korean government awarded him a posthumous Apostle of Peace medal in 2017. 25th April, dawn, ANZAC Day, the most sacred date in Australian military commemoration. The date Australia remembers Gallipoli. Across the continent, from Darwin to Hobart, people stand before memorials in the pre-dawn silence. A bugler plays the last post. Crowds are quiet. On this day, 3 RAR had been fighting for its life, on another peninsula, on another continent, in another war, but on the 25th of April. The irony was so precise it felt scripted. It wasn't. Saunders captured it exactly. At last I felt like an ANZAC, and I imagined there were 600 others like me. The attacks on the Canadians peter out by morning. Stone requests aerial resupply at 400 hours. Around 1000 hours, 4 USC 119 flying boxcars from Japan drop food, water, and, critically, 81mm mortar ammunition directly onto Hill 677. By 1400, B Company patrols find the Kapyong Road open. Elements of the US 5th Cavalry Regiment push the Chinese off Hill 504 and recapture Chuktunni. 2 PPCLI is relieved on April 26th. Through the entire battle, 5 companies of attached US and UK units, 2 companies of the 2nd Chemical Heavy Mortar Battalion, 2 companies of the 74th Engineer Combat Battalion, and 1 Middlesex company fled the battlefield without orders. Abandoned mortars, weapons, 50 trucks of ammunition and supplies, mortars that could have supported the defense, trucks that could have evacuated wounded, all of it left on the road, and some of it later recovered by the Chinese. Stone's bitter assessment, bug-outs were the accepted manner of withdrawing. The word bug-out became the unofficial term of the Korean War. The Australians and Canadians didn't use it. They stayed. General Order No. 453, Headquarters, 8th United States, Army Korea, June 23, 1951. The citation's language is unusually vivid for a military document. The enemy attacked savagely under the clangor of bugles and trumpets. The forward elements were completely surrounded going through the first day and into the second. Again and again, the enemy threw waves of troops at the gallant defenders. In some instances, when the enemy penetrated the defenses, the commanders directed friendly artillery fire on their own positions in repelling the thrusts. The seriousness of the breakthrough on the central front had been changed from defeat to victory by the gallant stand of these heroic and courageous soldiers. 3 units received the award: 3 RAR, 2 PPCLI, and A Company, 72nd Heavy Tank Battalion. General Van Fleet personally presented the citation to 3 RAR at a parade in Korea. The Canadians got a different treatment. Ottawa refused to let the battalion accept the award for 5 years, citing protocol. Van Fleet hadn't sought advance Canadian government permission. The Canadians couldn't wear the citation until 1956, when it was formally presented by the US ambassador in Calgary. Today, every serving member of 2 PPCLI still wears the blue shoulder flash. Now, the individual awards. And here's where it cuts deeper than the battle itself. Ferguson received the Distinguished Service Order. Montgomery earned the Military Cross for his bayonet charge. Private Davy of B Company got the Military Medal. Among the Canadians, Private Wayne Mitchell earned the Distinguished Conduct Medal for charging the enemy 3 times with his Bren gun, despite being wounded. Private Kenneth Barwise received the Military Medal for recovering a Vickers gun and killing 6 Chinese soldiers. Captain Mills earned the Military Cross. Stone later received a 2nd bar to his DSO for his Korean service. Major Ben O'Dowd received nothing. The man who effectively commanded 3 RAR in the field after Ferguson's HQ was overrun, who coordinated all 4 rifle companies through the night, relaying through adjacent companies because direct comms were dead, who organized the counterattack at dawn that threw the Chinese off the position, who planned and executed a fighting withdrawal across 3 kilometers of ridgeline under pursuit without losing a single man, who, when told his battalion had been reported destroyed, replied with the dry calm of a man too exhausted for emotion, nothing. Veteran Jack Galloway later recounted that Lieutenant General Sir Horace Robertson, commander of Commonwealth forces, was so elated after the battle that he immediately pinned a DSO ribbon on Ferguson's chest. The medal, Galloway suggested, that belonged to Ben O'Dowd. O'Dowd wrote his memoir, In Valiant Company, in 2000. His biography, Ben O'Dowd, Hero of Kapyong by Rory Steele, was published in 2019. 19 years after the memoir, 68 years after the battle, signaller Private Horace Madden, captured during the fighting, was awarded a posthumous George Cross for exemplary conduct as a prisoner of war. He died of malnutrition on November 6, 1951, 6 months after Kapyong. He was 22, and the 16th Field Regiment RNZA, whose guns were arguably the single most important factor in the battle's outcome, did not receive the Presidential Unit Citation. They received the Republic of Korea Presidential Unit Citation, but it wasn't formally presented until 2011, 60 years later. As Britannica observed, this reflected the tendency to downplay the importance of the artillery in halting the Chinese. The Forgotten War. It's a cliche, but cliches don't come from nowhere. The Korean War sits wedged between the clear moral narrative of the Second World War and the domestic upheaval of Vietnam. It ended in stalemate. Technically, hasn't ended at all. The 1953 armistice was a ceasefire agreement, not a peace treaty. No Hollywood myth-making, no protest culture. Even Altman's MASH was really about Vietnam with a Korean backdrop. Korea was the shadow of someone else's war. The inconclusive result made commemoration awkward. The Second World War ended in unconditional surrender. Vietnam ended with the helicopter evacuation from the embassy roof. A trauma, but a trauma you could narrativize. Korea ended with both sides roughly back where they started, 3 years of fighting, almost 40,000 American dead, 17,000 from Commonwealth nations, and all of it for the status quo. How do you fit that into a national story? How do you hold a victory parade when there was no victory? And Kapyong suffers doubly. It was primarily an Australian-Canadian battle in a war dominated by American historiography. Incheon, Chosin Reservoir, Pork Chop Hill absorb all the narrative oxygen. American historians write about American operations. Australian historians, and there are few of them, write for an Australian audience that already considers Gallipoli and Kokoda more theirs. Canadian historians ignored Korea for decades, but the Chinese perspective adds something. PLA histories refer to Kapyong as the Battle of Jiaping. Chinese internal assessments acknowledge the Spring Offensive's failure, citing high attrition rates, exacerbated by inadequate medical evacuation and ammunition resupply, as key factors in the offensive's strategic shortfall. The Fifth Phase Offensive was the last all-out offensive the Chinese launched for the remainder of the war. After Kapyong and the Imjin, PLA leadership shifted from attempting to drive the UN out of Korea to pursuing negotiations. This doesn't mean Kapyong alone stopped the war. The 29th British Brigade on the Imjin, American divisions on other sectors, the general collapse of PVA logistics all played their part. But the Kapyong Valley was one of 2 main routes to Seoul. If it had fallen, Peng Dehuai might have kept his promise about that May Day parade. 2 battalions of the Commonwealth took that possibility away from him. One thing needs correcting for a documentary audience: the human wave image. US Army historian Roy Edgar Appelman called the picture of overwhelming Chinese numbers on a broad front a myth. SLA Marshall noted the word mass was indiscriminately used by the media. The actual Chinese doctrine was the 3-3 system. 3 men form 1 fire team, 3 fire teams form 1 squad, arranged in staggered arrowhead formations attacking 1 point from 2 sides. This was sophisticated infiltration and shock tactics, not mindless human sacrifice. At Kapyong, though, the terrain funneled attacks into narrow fronts, and what Australian veterans saw was exactly what it looked like. Rifleman Mick Servos described it accurately. They were a tough and clever enemy, and they just charged in, wave after wave after wave. The distinction matters. The Chinese were brave, skilled soldiers operating under appalling logistic constraints, not a faceless horde. What happened to these people? Ferguson retired as a colonel in 1967, died in Canberra on the 21st of December, 1988. O'Dowd spent a decade after the army building up the Victorian State Emergency Services. Hands that had commanded a rifle company at Kapyong spent years coordinating flood relief and bushfire response. Reg Saunders left the army in 1954, worked in logging and metalwork. The hands that commanded a rifle company at Kapyong cut timber and bent steel. Then he became a liaison officer for the Department of Aboriginal Affairs, awarded the MBE in 1971. Became a significant Indigenous military figure, living proof that men his own country had considered less than full citizens for over a century had fought for it as well as anyone, and better than most. He died in 1990. His name is carried by barracks in Victoria today. Jim Stone returned to British Columbia, made a member of the Order of Canada in 1994. The South Korean government posthumously designated him an official Korean war hero and legend of Kapyong in December 2016. He died on November 24, 2005. He was 97. Lieutenant Colonel Frank Hassett, who succeeded Ferguson as 3RARCO and later commanded at Mariang San, rose to become General Sir Francis George Hassett, ACKBE CBDSO, Chief of the Australian Defence Force. And recognition, when it finally comes from Korea. Kapyong County has donated over 70 pieces of granite and quartz rock from the battle site for memorials around the world: Perth, Winnipeg, Langley, Airdrie, Brampton, Niagara Falls, Banff. The Perth Memorial, unveiled on July 27, 2023, features a 10-ton stone centerpiece carved from the Kapyong battlefield, bearing the names of 1,916 Western Australian servicemen who served in Korea. In April 2026, the 75th anniversary, the Royal Australian Mint issued a commemorative 50-cent coin, 32 poppies, one for each digger of 3 RAR killed at Kapyong, and the coordinates of the battle location. The key sources remain Robert O'Neill's Australia in the Korean War, 1950-53, 2 volumes published by the Australian War Memorial in 1981 and 1985. O'Neill, who later held the Chichile Professorship of the History of War at Oxford, died on the 19th of April 2023. His Chapter 8 on Kapyong, Volume 2, pages 131 to 160, is the definitive Australian account. Bob Breen's The Battle of Kapyong, 1992, provides the most detailed tactical analysis. For the Canadian side, Hub Gray's Beyond the Danger Close, 2003, and Dan Bjarnason's Triumph at Kapyong, 2011. War diaries for 3 RAR are held at the Australian War Memorial, including O'Dowd's personal papers. Collection PR 89/055. The numbers tell the story: a brigade minus against 2 divisions, 94 Australian and 33 to 47 Canadian casualties against an estimated 2,000 plus Chinese killed. But the numbers miss what matters most. This was a battle won by terrain sense, artillery skill, and the discipline of individual soldiers in weapon pits who chose not to leave. The New Zealand gunners who dropped shells within 50 meters of friendly troops through a long night. The Canadian lieutenant who called fire on his own head. The Aboriginal captain who finally felt like an ANZAC. The major who commanded a battle his CO could no longer control, brought every man out alive, and received nothing for it. America honored it with the highest unit decoration it possesses. Australia and Canada largely let it slip from memory, and South Korea, the nation that exists because of what happened on Hills 500, 4 and 677, carves memorial stones from the battlefield and ships them across oceans. The forgotten battle inside the forgotten war is remembered best by the people it saved.